The morning I found Daniel Hartley's resume in my inbox, I'd been sitting at the head of a conference table that seats 18 people, reviewing the quarterly numbers for a company I had built from a one-room office above a dry cleaner on Mercer Street. I thought seeing his name on my screen would undo me. I'd spent 10 years preparing for that kind of undoing, building walls specifically designed to keep that particular earthquake out. What I did not expect, what I could not have possibly prepared for, was that his application was not a coincidence. It was the opening move in a game that had already started without me. His email arrived at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning in September, tucked between a vendor proposal and a calendar reminder for my board meeting at 10. The subject line read, "Application, Senior Acquisitions Manager, Daniel Hartley." Just that. Clean, professional, stripped of any acknowledgement that we had once shared a bed, a mortgage, a dog named Hector, and 12 years of a life I had believed was permanent. I read his name 3 times before the coffee cup in my hand registered wait again. And then, because I had learned in the last decade that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is flinch, I set the cup down very carefully, straightened the sleeve of my jacket, and opened the attachment. His resume was excellent. That was the first thing that enraged me, and the first thing that frightened me, because an excellent resume meant he wasn't coming to me broken. He was coming to me polished, and that meant he had a plan. I want to tell you this story the way I have only told it once before. To my lawyer, in a room that smelled of old paper and lemon polish, while outside the windows of her 42nd floor office, the city went about its entirely indifferent business. I want to tell it fully, from the beginning, because the beginning matters more than you'd think. The beginning is where I left breadcrumbs I didn't know I was leaving. It's where every warning was buried under enough warmth and routine that I walked right past it, year after year, convinced that what I felt was love and what surrounded me was safety. I was 26 years old when I met Daniel. I was 28 when I married him. I was 34 when he sat across from me in our kitchen, the kitchen I had remodeled myself, choosing the tile grout colour from a fan of 27 near-identical shades of cream, and told me he was in love with someone else. Her name was Tiffany. She was 23. She had been his assistant at the acquisitions firm where he worked as a senior analyst, and she had green eyes and a way of laughing at his jokes that he described, with a kind of helpless sincerity that I found more devastating than cruelty would have been, as effortless. "It just happened," he said, as though love were a weather event, as though 12 years of a shared life could be dissolved by the phrase, "it just happened," the way a sugar cube dissolves in hot water, completely, leaving no trace of its original shape. I did not throw anything. I did not scream. I sat very still in the kitchen chair, with the coffee going cold in front of me, and I looked at the man I had loved since I was 26 years old. And I thought, with a clarity that I mistook for calm, this is the last morning of the life I thought I was living. I was right about that. What I was wrong about was everything that came after. I thought the story ended there. I thought the worst thing Daniel Hartley could do to me had already been done. I was spectacularly wrong. Let me go back a little further, because the texture of that marriage matters. Not its every detail. I have no interest in cataloguing 12 years of a relationship the way an insurance adjuster catalogues the contents of a burned house. But certain things need to be said, because later, when the full shape of what Daniel did becomes visible, those things will make sense in a way they couldn't have otherwise. We met at a friend's dinner party in the fall. He was funny in a way that surprised me. Quick, self-deprecating, with a gift for the absurd detail that made ordinary stories unforgettable. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when it was humid, and he wore his confidence the way some men wear a good coat, easily, without vanity, as though it had simply always been there. I was finishing a master's degree in business administration and working 60-hour weeks as an analyst at a real estate investment firm. He was 3 years into a career in corporate acquisitions and already being talked about as someone with a future. We were, everyone agreed, a good match. We looked like a good match on paper, and we felt like one in practice, which is a rarer thing than people admit. We got married in June, in the backyard of my parents' house in Connecticut, under a tent that cost more than my first car, and in a dress that my mother cried over in the dressing room. It was a good wedding. We were happy, genuinely and without performance, in the way that people are happy when they are young enough to believe that being happy is primarily a matter of choosing the right person. We bought a house, a brownstone in Brooklyn, 3 floors, a garden that neither of us was disciplined enough to maintain, but that we both loved to sit in on summer evenings with glasses of wine and the paper. We got Hector, a basset hound with an expression of permanent philosophical disappointment, who became the most important non-human presence in both our lives. We talked about children without urgency, in the way people do when they're still too absorbed in their own lives to feel the absence of anyone else's. And through all of it, I worked. I worked the way I had always worked, which is to say relentlessly, with the kind of focus that other people sometimes called ambition, and that I called simply necessity. The necessity of building something that was mine, something that could not be taken away. I had grown up watching my mother defer every professional dream she'd had to the management of a household and a husband who was decent, but who filled every room with his own requirements. And I had made a private and absolute decision at some point in my adolescence that I would never be the woman in that house. So I worked. I built. While Daniel moved steadily up the ladder at his firm, I left my analyst position and, with my savings and a small business loan and an investor who believed in me more than I had any right to expect, I started Ardent Capital, a boutique real estate investment and acquisitions advisory firm that, for the first 2 years, operated out of a single rented office with second-hand furniture and a staff of 3, including myself. Daniel was supportive. I want to be fair about this. In those early years, he was genuinely supportive. He celebrated my first client, my first deal, my first year in the black. He told people about my work at dinner parties with a pride that seemed real. He covered more than his share of the mortgage during the lean months without complaint. There was nothing in those years that looked like what it later turned out to be. There were only small things, small enough to be invisible, or at least ignorable. The slight edge that sometimes entered his voice when I talked about a deal going well. The way he occasionally deflected my professional accomplishments with a pivot. "That's great, babe, but did I tell you what Marcus said about the Henderson account?" That I filed away as a minor personality tic rather than a signal. The fact that as Ardent grew, and as my name began appearing in trade publications and on panels and at industry events, something in Daniel's posture around me shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, just by a few degrees, like a photograph that's been very slightly tilted out of alignment. I noticed these things. I am not going to tell you I didn't notice them, because I did. And the truth is that I managed them in the way that people manage uncomfortable truths, when the alternative, facing them head-on, feels too costly. I managed them by being especially warm when he seemed withdrawn, by making space in conversations for his accomplishments, by choosing, again and again, to interpret his behavior through the most charitable lens available. He was tired. Work was stressful. All marriages have friction. These are the things I told myself, and they were not entirely untrue, which made them effective as explanations, and therefore as blinders. Tiffany joined his firm when she was 21. She was there for 2 years before Daniel mentioned her to me in anything other than passing. And when he did mention her, casually, one evening over dinner, "My assistant Tiffany is actually really sharp. She's been helping me prep for the Goldman pitch." I felt absolutely nothing. Not a flicker. Because I trusted my husband, and because the most reliable feature of betrayal is that it is always happening slightly outside your field of vision. He left in April. He was gone by the first week of May. He moved into an apartment in the East Village, convenient, as it happened, to where Tiffany lived, and within 2 months they were photographed together at a rooftop bar, and within 6 months they were officially a couple, and within the year he had filed for divorce, and she was wearing a ring that I recognized, with a sickening lurch, as being suspiciously similar to one I had shown him in a magazine 3 years earlier, and said I'd always loved. The divorce was not acrimonious, which is to say that it was devastating, but orderly. We had no children. The house was in both our names. I bought out his share with money I took from my personal account and a bridge loan I paid back in 14 months. We divided our possessions with the particular, horrible efficiency of 2 people who were determined not to speak to each other any longer than necessary. He took Hector. That was the thing that broke me open in a way that nothing else had. Not the apartment, not the photographs, not even the ring. He took Hector because Tiffany liked dogs, and because he knew, in the precise and merciless way that people who have loved you know things about you, that it would hurt most. I signed the final divorce papers on a rainy Thursday afternoon in the office of a lawyer whose name I don't remember, and then I walked to the subway and rode it for 45 minutes without getting off at any stop. Just sitting in the yellow light with the roar of the tumult around me, and my hands folded in my lap, and my face entirely still. And I made myself a second private promise. The first had been made watching my mother. This one I made watching my own reflection in the dark window glass of the sea train. I would never again make myself small enough to fit inside someone else's story. I would build something so completely, irrevocably mine that no person, no marriage, no betrayal, no version of "it just happened" could ever threaten it. And then I went home, and I worked. 10 years is a long time. It is long enough to build a company from 12 employees to 94, from a single rented office to 3 floors of a building in Midtown that I own outright, purchased in 2027 after a series of acquisitions advisory deals that made the kind of profit that people in our industry talked about for a full fiscal year. It is long enough to sit on the board of 2 non-profits, to be profiled in 3 trade magazines, and one that my mother keeps on her coffee table with a possessiveness that still makes me laugh. To be invited to give a keynote at a conference where, 10 years earlier, I had sat in the 3rd row taking notes on a legal pad. 10 years is long enough to become someone other people want to become. Long enough to forget, or nearly forget, that you were once the kind of person who sat on a sea train watching herself try not to cry. I had not thought about Daniel Hartley with any real intensity for at least 4 years. He had existed in the corner of my awareness the way a scar does. You know it's there. You've stopped being surprised by it. You've made your peace with the fact that it is part of the topography of your skin now. I knew from mutual acquaintances and from the occasional LinkedIn notification I had been too human to disable entirely that he and Tiffany had married in 26/9, that he had spent several years at various acquisitions firms with what seemed like reasonable but not spectacular success, and that they had no children. Beyond that, I had neither sought nor received any information about his life, and I had been content with this arrangement because it was the only arrangement in which I could continue to be the person I had spent 10 years becoming. So when his resume appeared in my inbox on that Tuesday morning in September, the feeling was not grief. It was not longing. It was not even, at first, anger. It was something older and colder and harder to name. A feeling like hearing a sound that doesn't belong in the room you're sitting in. A feeling like wrongness. Like a note played slightly off-key in a melody you know by heart. I read his resume twice. It was, as I said, excellent. He was applying for the Senior Acquisitions Manager position that my HR director, Priya, had been trying to fill for 6 weeks, a role that would place whoever took it at the center of our deal pipeline, with access to our full portfolio of active acquisitions, our investor relationships, and our internal projections. It was a role that required trust above almost anything else. And Daniel Hartley, my ex-husband, the man who had spent 12 years in my life and then traded that life for a 23-year-old with effortless laughter, was sitting in my inbox asking me to give it to him. The absurdity of it should have been funny. I remember deciding, consciously and carefully, to find it funny. I closed his email. I drank my coffee. I went to my board meeting at 10. I said nothing to anyone. But I did not delete the email. 2 days passed. I kept the email open in a separate tab, the way you keep a wound you're not quite sure is infected, checking it periodically, watching for signs. On the 3rd day, I called Priya into my office and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she had any sense of how Daniel Hartley's application had come to us. Priya was thorough, and she was loyal, and she had been with me for 6 years. And she looked up from her tablet with an expression that told me she had not given this any particular thought until now. "Through the standard portal," she said. "Oh, actually, no. I think it came as a referral. Let me check." She pulled up the application file and scrolled through it while I watched the traffic 22 floors below my window. "Yes, it came through Marcus Webb. He sent it directly to the general HR inbox with a personal note." The floor did not drop out from under me. I'm telling you this because I want to be accurate about what I felt. And what I felt was not shock. Not yet. What I felt was the particular, focused stillness of a person who has just heard the sound that doesn't belong in the room, and who has understood all at once that the sound is much closer than she thought. Marcus Webb was a board member. He had been on my board for 3 years, brought in as an independent director after we crossed the 50 million threshold and our investors pushed for additional governance. He was smart, professionally credentialed, and personable in the way that men of his type are invariably personable, with a warmth that was genuine enough in the moment and invisible the moment you left the room. I had never had any particular reason to distrust him. I realized now, sitting very still in my office chair with the city spread below me like an indifferent map, had never had any particular reason to trust him. He was a board member. I had treated him accordingly. I had been, in this as in so many things that I would later think about, efficient. "Did you know that Marcus knows Daniel Hartley personally?" I asked Priya. She shook her head slowly. "I didn't. Should I?" "No," I said. "Thank you, Priya. That's all." After she left, I sat for a long time, and I thought about what Marcus Webb and Daniel Hartley had in common, besides my company, and my ex-husband's application. And then, with the slow and terrible patience of someone assembling a puzzle whose image is only beginning to resolve itself, I opened my browser and I started looking. They had gone to Duke together. That was the first piece. I found it in 10 minutes. A photograph on the university's alumni page, dated 2001. Some kind of fraternity event. The two of them grinning in the specific way of men who have not yet been required to be serious about anything. Daniel and Marcus. College friends. And Marcus had been on my board for 3 years. And in those 3 years, I had introduced him because I was professional, because I believed in the value of relationships, because I was building something and I used every opportunity to build it, to every significant investor in my portfolio. I had taken him to dinners. I had CC'd him on communications. I had sat beside him at industry events and talked, freely and trustingly, about the deals we were pursuing, the opportunities we were watching, the direction I was planning to take the company in the next 18 months. The nausea hit me low and fast, the way it always does when something you've been careful not to know suddenly becomes impossible not to know. I put my hand flat on the desk and breathed through it, through the tightening in my chest and the sudden bright anger that wanted to rise up and knock everything off my desk and demanded instead to be controlled. I breathed. I looked at the photograph of Marcus and Daniel on a Duke University lawn in 2001. I thought about the board meetings of the past 3 years. I thought about every conversation about deal flow, pipeline, acquisitions targets. And then I thought about what a senior acquisitions manager would have access to, sitting at the center of Ardent Capital's operations. And I understood, with a precision that felt like a blade, that the application in my inbox was not a coincidence, and it was not an act of desperation. It was the final piece of something that had been built very carefully over a long period of time. Something I had not been watching for because I had not known to watch. I called my lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Diane Cho, and she had been my personal counsel since the year after the divorce. And she had a way of listening to things that was completely unlike ordinary listening. Not passive, not even actively sympathetic, but forensic, alert. The way a surgeon listens when you describe symptoms. I told her what I knew, which at that point was only the outline of it. The application, the referral from Marcus, the connection I'd found online, my suspicion about what it might mean. I told her without drama, because Diane did not respond to drama, and because I was not, at that moment, feeling anything that could be described as dramatic. What I was feeling was cold, precise, directed. "Don't reject the application yet," Diane said when I finished. "Don't do anything yet. Give me 48 hours. "You think I should interview him?" There was a pause. I could hear her swiveling in her chair. She always swiveled when she was thinking. "I think you should let this play out a little further. You have suspicions, but you don't yet have evidence of anything actionable. If there's something here, we want to find it before you tip your hand. The moment you reject that application, if there is a plan in motion, it goes underground." I thought about that. I thought about Daniel Hartley sitting somewhere, an apartment, an office, a kitchen table, composing the most calculated email he'd ever sent me. And I thought about Marcus Webb nodding along and forwarding it with a personal note. And I thought about the 10 years I had spent building the thing that both of them, apparently, had decided was worth taking from me. "Fine," I said. 48 hours. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark of my bedroom, the master bedroom of my brownstone, which I had redecorated completely after the divorce, stripping it back to bare walls and starting over with the specific pleasure of a person who is remaking something that was damaged. And I stared at the ceiling and I let myself, just for a while, be in the full feeling of it. The anger, the disbelief that had been pooling beneath the surface of my careful professionalism since Tuesday morning. The particular searing quality of a wound that opens in a place you thought had long since healed. Because I want to be honest with you, it was not just professional. Even after 10 years, even after everything I had built, even after the sea train and the second promise, and the years of deliberate and successful self-reconstruction, the sight of Daniel's name in my inbox had reached through all of that and found something that was still, at some cellular level, unfinished. Not love. That was gone, and I mean gone completely, the way a fire is gone after the ground cools. But something adjacent to grief. Something that said, even now, even after everything you made of yourself, here he is, reaching into your world again. Not with regret, not with apology, with an acquisition strategy. I got up at 2 a.m. and made tea and sat at my kitchen island, the one I had chosen alone from a marble showroom in Soho, running my hand along 6 different samples before finding the one that felt right. And I let myself feel all of it. The anger at Daniel, which was sharp and specific. The anger at Marcus, which was colder and in some ways worse because it was fresher and because I had not seen it coming at all. And underneath both of those, something that I had not expected and that surprised me with its intensity. A kind of gratitude. Gratitude that I had trusted myself enough when I read that email to feel the wrongness of it immediately. Gratitude that I had spent 10 years becoming someone who did not flinch. Gratitude that this was happening now, when I had a board and a legal team and a company of 94 people, and Diane Cho's direct number saved in my phone. And not 12 years ago, when I was 28 and in love, and would have been destroyed. I drank my tea. The city hummed outside. At 3 a.m, I went back to bed and I slept, deeply and without dreams, for 4 hours. When I woke up, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Diane called me the next afternoon with the first substantive piece of what she'd found, and I want to describe that phone call in detail because I want you to understand the full shape of what was being planned. She had spoken to a contact at a competing firm, someone she trusted, someone who owed her a professional courtesy, and she had done what good lawyers do, which is to pull a thread and see what unravels. Marcus Webb, she said, and her voice had the quality it always had when she was delivering information she found genuinely interesting, has a financial interest in a company called Meridian Acquisitions Group. It's a holding structure, not publicly disclosed because it doesn't have to be. A 22% stake, held through an LLC that isn't registered in his name directly, but that traces back to him cleanly enough if you know where to look. Meridian is a direct competitor of yours. Not a big one, but they are currently pursuing at least 2 acquisition targets that I believe overlap significantly with deals you have in active pipeline. I was standing at my office window when she said this. I remember the precise quality of the afternoon light. Gold. Late September gold. The kind that makes the city look cleaner than it is. And the specific sensation of understanding something large and ugly that has been there all along. He's been feeding them information, I said. It was not a question. That's the allegation I intend to investigate very carefully before anyone says it out loud, Diane said. But yes, that appears to be the direction this points. And if Daniel Hartley were installed as your senior acquisitions manager, he would have access to everything the Ridian would need to outmaneuver you on both deals. Your full pipeline, your investor commitments, your price ceilings, your timeline. And in exchange, Daniel gets a job, Marcus gets a cut from Meridian, and I lose two of the biggest deals I've been building toward for the past 18 months. I heard my own voice, very flat, very even. How long has this been in motion? I don't know yet, but Marcus has been on your board for 3 years, and what I'm seeing suggests he's been positioning for this for at least the past 8 to 10 months. The application wasn't spontaneous. It was timed. You're at a moment where those two acquisitions are close enough to completion that the insider information would be maximally valuable. Whoever planned this knew your deal timeline. I thought about every board meeting, every presentation I had made, with my full deck and my projections and my careful, detailed analysis, to a room that included Marcus Webb. I thought about his questions, always relevant, always apparently engaged. And I thought about what those questions now looked like, understood correctly. Not curiosity, intelligence gathering. I felt sick, in a way that had nothing to do with Daniel anymore. Daniel was almost secondary. Daniel was the pawn. Marcus was the game. What do I do? I asked. You schedule the interview, Diane said. And then you let me keep pulling. I spent 3 days preparing for that interview, the way I have never prepared for anything in my professional life. And I have, over 10 years, prepared extensively for many things. I went back through every board meeting that had occurred in the past year, and I reviewed every piece of information Marcus would have had access to. I identified, with Diane's help, exactly what a bad actor in his position could have passed to a competitor, and what the value of that information would be. I also, because I needed to understand the full architecture of what I was walking into, did something that cost me more than I expected. I thought carefully and honestly about Daniel. Not about Daniel, my ex-husband, but about Daniel the professional. His strengths, his blind spots, the way he operated under pressure, the way he handled confrontation. Because I was going to be sitting across a desk from him in 72 hours, and I could not afford to be ambushed by my own history. The thing I understood, thinking about Daniel with professional clarity, was that he was good at charm and bad at judgment. He was perceptive about people in the way that charming people often are, attentive to what others wanted, skilled at reflecting it back to them. But his decisions, when they counted, tended toward the expedient over the sound. He had left a 12-year marriage for an assistant half his age. He was now, apparently, participating in what amounted to corporate espionage through a channel supplied by his college friend. These were not the decisions of a man with reliable, long-term judgment. They were the decisions of a man who looked for shortcuts and was very good at making shortcuts look like roads. I also understood, because I had been married to him, that Daniel would be expecting a version of me that no longer existed. He would be expecting the woman who had managed her discomfort and kept the peace and chosen the most charitable interpretation available. He would be expecting someone he could charm, or at least disarm, with the history between us. He would walk into that interview room with a strategy built on a version of me that I had been steadily, deliberately dismantling for 10 years. That was his first and most fatal error. It would not be his last. He walked into my conference room on a Thursday at 2 o'clock, and my first thought which I registered with a kind of detached anthropological interest, was that he looked good. Not in the way that would have meant anything to me, but in the observable, factual sense. He was fit, well-dressed, had the easy bearing of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was satisfied with his preparation. He was wearing a navy suit that I didn't recognize, which meant post-divorce, and he had that slight tan that comes from spending time somewhere warm in summer, and he walked into the room with his hand already extended and a smile that was perfectly calibrated between professional warmth and personal acknowledgement. "Claire," he said. And the way he said my name, with that slight, deliberate weight, that tiny additional press of familiarity, told me everything I needed to know about his strategy. He was going to use it. The history. He was going to wear it as an asset. I shook his hand. My grip was firm, and my face was neutral, and I said, "Mr. Hartley, thank you for coming in." And I watched his expression shift, just barely, just a millisecond flicker of recalibration, before settling back into the smile. We sat. I had positioned the room carefully. The chair I offered him had its back to the window, which meant he would be looking into the light, and I would not be. Diane had suggested this. It was a small thing, and it was petty, and I did not regret it for a second. "I'll be honest," he said, before I had asked a single question. "I thought about reaching out to you personally before sending the application. I decided it was better to come through the proper channel. Keep it professional." "That was thoughtful," I said. I looked at him steadily. I did not offer anything more. He continued, filling the silence the way he always had, smoothly, without apparent discomfort, as though silences were merely spaces that needed to be furnished. He talked about his experience over the past decade. Several firm names, a track record of completed transactions, a particular acquisition deal in the healthcare sector that he was clearly proud of, and that was genuinely impressive. I listened. I took notes. I asked follow-up questions that were entirely professional and entirely genuine, because I was conducting this interview for real. Not as theatre, but because I needed to understand exactly how much he knew, and how confident he was, and what he thought he was walking into. "Why Ardent?" I asked, 40 minutes in. Specifically, Ardent. He met my eyes. There it was. The slight softening. The deliberate invitation to acknowledge the obvious. "Ardent is one of the best boutique acquisitions advisory firms in the country. Your deal pipeline is exceptional. Your reputation is something people in this industry talk about." A pause. "And yes, I know the history here is unusual. I thought about that. I decided that if we could both be professional about it, the fact that we know each other is actually an asset. I understand your company's culture and your approach better than any outside hire possibly could." I wrote something in my notebook. I wrote, "He thinks the history is leverage." I underlined it. "Tell me about your current role," I said. His current role was at a firm called Clarendon Partners, where he had been for 2.5 years. I had looked up Clarendon. It was a small operation, competent but not distinguished. The kind of place where someone ends up when several better options haven't worked out. The kind of place where a man who had expected at this point in his career to be somewhere significantly more prominent learns to tell a story about his position that sounds like a choice rather than a landing. "I've been leading their mid-market acquisitions desk," he said. "Good work, good team, but limited deal flow at the tier I want to be operating at. Ardent is the step up I've been positioning for." I nodded. I wrote, "Limited options. And under that, he needs this." After the interview, after I walked him to the elevator with a handshake and a "we'll be in touch," and after the elevator doors had closed and I was standing alone in the hallway, I allowed myself 30 seconds of something very close to vertigo. Not grief, not longing, not anything soft. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a very high place and looking down. The awareness of the drop. The awareness of your own capacity to either fall or step back. I looked at the closed elevator doors, and I thought about the man who had just been sitting across from me, confident and polished, and walking into a trap he had helped build himself. And I felt something move through me that I recognized, because I had felt it before. It was the icy version of fury. The kind that doesn't heat you up, the kind that makes you very, very quiet, and very, very precise. I called Diane from my car. "How did it go?" she asked. "He doesn't know I know," I said. "He thinks the interview was real." "Good." She paused. "I have more." What Diane told me next required me to pull over. I had been driving, or rather my driver had been driving and I had been in the back seat. And when I heard what she said, I put my hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Could you pull over, please?" And he did, without question, because Carlos had been driving for me for 4 years and had learned to read the quality of my silences. And this particular silence had a quality he recognized as requiring stillness. The additional information Diane had found was this: Marcus Webb had not been acting alone. He had a partner in the structure, someone else who was feeding information about Ardent's operations to Meridian Acquisitions Group. That partner was not an outside player. That partner was Randall Kim, who was Ardent Capital's chief financial officer, and who had been with the company for 4 years, and who sat in on every deal meeting, and had access to every projection and every investor communication, and every piece of confidential financial information that Ardent Capital produced. Randall, who had been in the office 3 doors down from mine for 4 years, who had attended every Christmas party and every client dinner and every quarterly review, who had sat across from me and Diane and looked both of us in the eye on 17 different occasions, who had a wife named Jenny and 2 kids whose names I knew and whose school play I had once attended, because he had mentioned it, and it seemed like the kind of thing a good employer does. "How?" I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. Just that one word, with everything in it that couldn't be expressed. "Money," Diane said, with the brisk, unsentimental precision of someone who has spent 20 years in law and knows that the answer to how is almost always money. "He's been receiving payments through a consulting arrangement with an entity that connects back to Meridian. Small amounts, nothing that would flag on its own, but consistent. Over the past 14 months. 14 months. While I had been trusting him. While I had been treating him as a member of my team. Someone I depended on. Someone I had brought into the inner circle of everything I built. While he had been sitting 3 doors down and selling it. I sat in the back of the pulled-over car on a street in Midtown, and I looked at my own hands. And I thought about the 12-year marriage and the sea train and the second promise and the 10 years. And I felt something happen inside me that I can only describe as a kind of irreversible decision. Not rage. Rage is hot and it dissipates. This was something colder and heavier and more enduring. It settled in my chest like ballast, and it made me very, very level. "Who else knows about this?" I asked. "Right now? You, me, and my investigator." "Good," Let's keep it that way for exactly long enough to gather everything we need. Then I want all of it. Every payment record, every communication, every connection between Marcus, Randall, Daniel, and Meridian. I want it airtight. And then I want to move.
How fast?
I looked out the car window at the city going by. I'll tell you when. There was a board meeting scheduled for 3 weeks out. I let it stay on the calendar. I let Marcus Webb attend our regular check-in calls and ask his intelligence-gathering questions and take his careful notes. And I answered those questions with the specific, targeted misinformation that Diane and I had prepared. Plausible enough to be convincing, wrong enough in the details that mattered, to render anything he passed along useless. I watched him on those calls with a new kind of attention, stripped of all the professional goodwill I had extended for 3 years. And what I saw was not the man I had thought I knew, but something else. A person performing trustworthiness. A person who had practiced it for so long that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. At least to someone who was not specifically looking. I also had 2 conversations I had not anticipated, and that changed the shape of the story for me in ways I am still, even now, processing.
The first was with Priya.
I called her into my office on a Friday afternoon after the building had mostly emptied, and I told her everything. Not because I had to, I could have managed what came next without her, but because she had been with me for 6 years, and because what was happening had happened partly in her orbit, through her HR function, and she deserved to know. She sat across from me and listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said something that I think about often.
Do you know why I've stayed here 6 years? She asked.
I shook my head. She looked at me steadily. Because in 6 years, you have never once asked me to cover anything up. Other places I've worked, 3 of them, I was asked to be part of things I wasn't comfortable with. Quietly. Always quietly. She paused. I just want you to know that whatever you need me to do in the next few weeks, I'll do it. And I won't be quiet about what I see.
I thanked her.
And I had to look away for a moment because the plainness of her loyalty, after 3 weeks of learning the full catalogue of other people's betrayal, was almost too much to sit with directly. The second conversation was one I did not initiate. Her name, when it appeared on my phone, sent a flash of something old and electric through me. That autonomic response that 12 years of marriage had written into my nervous system, and that 10 years had not entirely erased. Tiffany Hartley. I stared at it through 2 full rings. Then I answered. Claire, she said. Her voice was not what I expected. It was not the voice I had constructed in my imagination over a decade. Young, breezy, effortless. It was tired. It was the voice of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has decided at last to put it down. I know this is strange. I know you have every reason to hang up. Please don't. I didn't. I left Daniel 8 months ago, she said. I want you to know that first, because what I'm about to tell you, I'm telling you as someone who is not on his side anymore. I'm not sure I've been on his side for a long time. She took a breath. He told me about the plan. Not everything. I don't think he told me everything. But enough. He told me about Marcus and about the job at your company and about what he was supposed to do once he was inside. And I didn't say anything right away because we were still... because I thought I could talk him out of it. Her voice caught. I couldn't. And then I left. And I've been sitting with this for 8 months, and I can't keep sitting with it. There was a silence between us that contained 10 years of everything I had never said to her and she had never said to me. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. My voice was even. I had earned even. "Because you built something," she said. "And I watched him. I watched him for 7 years, and I know how he looks when he's about to destroy something someone built. And I'm tired of being the person who let that happen." Another breath. "I know I'm the last person who has any right to do you a favor. I know that. I needed to do one anyway." I wrote down everything she told me. Her voice steadied as she talked, becoming more specific, more detailed. Dates, amounts, the name of the LLC, a conversation she had overheard between Daniel and Marcus that she had later written down because something about it had frightened her. She told me about the state of Daniel's finances, the deals that hadn't closed, the severance that had run out, the debts that had accumulated quietly behind the facade of the navy suit and the easy bearing. She told me about Meridian and what they had promised him. She told me, at the end, something that she prefaced with a long pause and that she seemed to offer as a kind of confession. "He always resented you, you know. Not the way people resent failure, the way people resent something that reminds them of what they chose not to be." After I hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet of my office. Outside, the city was doing what cities do: indifferent, continuous, relentless. Inside, something had shifted, very slightly, in the architecture of the story I had been telling myself about the last 10 years. Not enough to change the ending, but enough to make me understand it differently. The board meeting was on a Wednesday. I had moved it to the large conference room, the one with a long table and the glass walls that overlooked the city. And I had invited not just the board, but also several key investors, telling them I had significant updates on our strategic pipeline that I wanted to share in person. Marcus arrived 8 minutes early, which he always did, a habit that I had once interpreted as diligence and now recognized as the watchfulness of someone managing multiple versions of himself in a single room. He sat near the center of the table with his portfolio open, and his expression settled into the look of relaxed attention that I had spent 3 years finding reassuring. I looked at him once when he came in, gave him the same professional nod I would give anyone, and then I did not look at him again until I was ready. Diane was seated at the far end of the table as my personal counsel, which was not unusual. What was unusual, and which I saw Marcus register with the faintest adjustable of his posture, was the man sitting beside her. Brian Fells, a senior partner at a firm that specialized in securities and corporate fraud, who had accompanied several of our investor attendees in a capacity that I had described to Marcus only as legal review of the Q4 pipeline. I began the meeting normally. Agenda items, quarterly review, pipeline overview. I went through 18 minutes of the most boring and procedurally routine content in Ardent's recent history, and I watched Marcus's posture gradually relax as the meeting seemed to confirm itself as exactly what it was billed to be. He contributed twice, relevant, engaged comments, and I thanked him each time with the professional appreciation I had always extended. Then I reached the acquisitions pipeline section, and I said, "Before I continue, I need to address something that affects the integrity of this company and this board, and I need to do it here, in front of our investors and our counsel, because that is the only context in which it can be properly addressed." I heard the room change temperature. It was not a dramatic sound, no gasps, no sudden movement. It was more like the quality of the air shifted, became denser and more alert. I saw Marcus's hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, go very slightly still. 3 weeks ago, I said, I received a job application for our senior acquisitions manager position. The application was submitted by Daniel Hartley, my ex-husband. It was referred by Marcus Webb, a member of this board, with a personal note. I paused, let it sit. I chose to investigate before taking any action. What I found over the course of that investigation is the following. I spoke for 11 minutes without consulting my notes more than twice. I laid out every piece, the Duke connection, the Meridian stake, the LLC, the 14 months of payments to Randall Kim, the timing of the application relative to our active deal pipeline, the conversations Diane's investigator had documented, and the statement from Tiffany Hartley, which was included in the package at every seat. I spoke the way I speak when I know I have the room. Not loudly, not with any flourish, but with the patient precision of someone who has done the work and is simply reporting what the work produced. I did not look at Marcus while I spoke. I watched the investors. I watched their faces as the shape of it became clear to them. Not just the betrayal of me specifically, but the exposure it represented for their own investments. When I finished, the room was completely silent. Marcus said, "Claire," and his voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. A roughness, a slight unsteadiness that told me the performance was finally costing him something it couldn't absorb. "Mr. Webb," I said, turning to look at him for the first time since the room changed. "My counsel will be addressing anything further with you directly. I'm not going to debate this here." I looked at him for a long, steady moment. I wanted him to see, clearly and without any ambiguity, that what he was looking at was not the person he had spent 3 years believing he was managing. I wanted him to see the distance between who he thought I was and who I actually was. And I wanted him to understand that that distance was precisely the thing that had undone him. Thank you for your service on this board. It is terminated effective immediately, with full documentation of the cause. I turned back to the room. Brian Fells opened the folder in front of him. What followed was not swift, because these things are never swift, and I want to tell it honestly, rather than as a montage of consequences that arrive in clean, satisfying sequence. The investigation by Diane's firm, and by the Financial Compliance Authority to which we reported, took 4 months. During those 4 months, I ran my company with the same deliberateness I had always brought to it, with the additional complexity of a CFO position that had to be managed and eventually replaced. Priya ran the financial operations with the quiet, unflappable competence that I had come to rely on like a structural element, and with the knowledge that the process was happening in parallel to everything else, that papers were being filed, and interviews were being conducted, and records were being subpoenaed, and that at some point it would resolve, and I would know what resolution looked like. Marcus Webb resigned from 2 other boards before he could be removed from them. He retained his own legal team, and for a period of several weeks, there was a formal dispute about the extent of his liability, which, I will not pretend, did not consume an enormous amount of my energy and attention, because it did. That Diane was thorough, and what she had was thorough, and the financial interest in Meridian was documented with a kind of specificity that does not leave a great deal of room for alternative interpretations. He reached a settlement rather than proceeding to litigation. He paid a significant financial penalty. He did not, ultimately, face criminal charges, which, I will tell you plainly, was a frustration. But I had been advised, consistently and accurately, to focus on what was achievable and not on what would be satisfying. And the settlement achieved what mattered most. It made the thing public. It severed his connection to my company, and it removed Meridian's ability to use anything they had been fed, because the pipeline information they had received was now known to be tainted by an illegal arrangement, which made it legally unusable and professionally radioactive.
Randall Kim resigned and repaid, under the terms of a separate agreement, the consulting fees he had received. He lost his CFO certification for a period of 2 years. He did not, as far as I know, find another position in the industry, though I did not look. What I remember about Randall, at the end of it, was a single moment in the hallway outside my office, 3 days after the board meeting, when he came to collect his things. He stopped when he saw me. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at the floor. I waited, and he did not say whatever he had intended to say. And eventually he looked up, and the thing on his face was not anger, and was not defiance, and was not even a coherent emotion. It was something smaller and sadder and more permanent. The face of someone who has understood, too late, the difference between the decision they made and the person they wanted to be. I held the door of his office open for him while he carried his box out. I did not say anything either. Some silences are complete in themselves. Daniel Hartley was never offered the position. His application was formally rejected during the investigation, before the board meeting, with a standard template email from Priya that acknowledged receipt of his materials and informed him that the position had been filled with another candidate. He attempted to contact me twice, once by email, which I did not respond to, and once through a phone call that I let go to voicemail and that I played back once. He sounded, in the voicemail, like someone who had been expecting a different outcome and was adjusting in real time to a reality that had not cooperated. He said he just wanted to talk. He said he thought we could be adult about this. He said, and this was the last thing he said before the message cut off, the last words of his that I ever heard. I just thought that after everything, you'd at least... He didn't finish the sentence. I deleted the voicemail. I never learned exactly what he thought I would at least do, and I find, when I think about it now, that I don't need to. There is one more thing I want to tell you about that period, and it is the thing I have found most difficult to tell accurately, because it involves the most complicated feeling I had through all of it. Tiffany reached out again, 6 weeks after the board meeting. She had been contacted by Diane's team as part of the investigation, and she had provided her statement, and she had done it willingly and completely. The email she sent me afterward was short. She said she was sorry. Not in the performative, self-serving way that apologies sometimes come packaged, with a request for absolution, with the expectation of warmth in return. She was just sorry. She said she knew that what she'd done 10 years ago was wrong, and that she had known it at the time and had done it anyway, and that there was no version of an explanation that made that better. She said she was grateful that she'd been able to do something that mattered, at the end. I held that email for a long time without responding to it. I thought about what to say, and I thought about what I actually felt. And what I actually felt was this: that the version of Tiffany I had spent 10 years constructing in my imagination, the thoughtless, airy, laughing person who had not understood the weight of what she was taking, was not the whole person. That the person who had sat on a phone with her ex-husband's ex-wife and given her detailed, careful, consequential information was someone who had made a bad choice at 23 and spent 7 years being formed by its consequences. And that this did not redeem the original choice, but did make it more human than my imagination had allowed. And I thought about whether that mattered. And I decided that it did. Not to my outcome, which was already secured, but to my own capacity to understand the story I had lived through correctly. To see it without the distortions that a decade of careful avoidance can produce.
I wrote back a single line. I said, "Thank you for what you did. I hope the next chapter is better." I don't know if it will be. I don't know if mine will be, in all the ways that count. What I know is that I intend to find out. It is January now. 4 months since the board meeting. 5 months since the Tuesday morning in September when Daniel's resume landed in my inbox, and a version of my life I had thought was finished announced, without invitation, that it had one more act. My office looks the same as it always has. The city 22 floors below, the long table, the glass walls, the view that I chose deliberately when we moved into this building, because I wanted to be able to look up from my desk and see something without limits. On my desk, there is a small cactus that Priya gave me the week after Randall left, with a note that said, "Low maintenance, high resilience, thrives on neglect." It has bloomed twice since September. Both times I found it unreasonably moving. I have a new CFO, a woman named Sandra, who has been in the industry for 15 years and whose references were checked by 3 separate people, and whose first month in the role produced a financial analysis so clean and so rigorous that I asked her at the end of her 30th day whether she had any questions. She said she had one. She asked why there were so many security protocols on the document sharing system. I told her there had been a breach, and that I had rebuilt the protocols from the ground up, and that I would brief her fully if she wanted. She said she wanted. I liked her very much. The 2 acquisition deals that Marcus and Daniel had been positioning to compromise are both still in our pipeline. One of them closed last month at a number that exceeded our projections. The other is on track for Q2. I sat in the closing meeting for the first one, and I watched the signatures go down on the paper. 7 signatures from 3 parties, each one representing months of work and relationship and careful analysis. And I thought about the fact that this deal would not exist without the company I had spent 10 years building. And the company would not exist without the 10 years. And the 10 years would not have happened the way they did without the kitchen table and the rainy Thursday afternoon and the sea train. I thought about the chain of it, the way some things that are done to you become the force that carries you. I walked out of the closing meeting and into the hall, and the building was warm and smelled of coffee and carpet, and the particular neutral smell of an office tower in winter. And I stood for a moment with my hand on the wall, and I breathed, and I felt, with a completeness that surprised me, something that I can only call satisfaction. Not the triumphant theatrical kind. The other kind. The quiet, structural kind. That comes when you have done what you set out to do, and the work has held. I have not thought about Daniel since his voicemail. I mean that. Not with anger, not with grief, not with the residual tenderness that I spent the better part of a decade quietly managing. He exists somewhere in the city. Or doesn't. I genuinely don't know. In whatever version of his life the choices he made have assembled for him. I wish him nothing specific. I have no feeling about him that I need to manage anymore. The cactus is on the windowsill now, because Priya moved it when she decided it needed more light. She was right. The second bloom appeared the week after she moved it. It is small and very precise and slightly absurd, and every morning when I come in and see it there against the January sky, I think about what she wrote on the note. Thrives on neglect. I think about the years I spent becoming someone who could not be easily taken from, and about how the process of that becoming required neglecting certain things, certain softnesses, certain surrenders, certain habits of accommodation that had once seemed like love and were partly something else. I think about what it costs and what it makes. I think about how some mornings I still pour 2 cups of coffee before I remember that it's only me. Old programming, nothing more. And I think about how I drink both, standing at the kitchen island with the marble I chose alone, watching the morning come in through the window I chose alone, in the house that is mine, in every particular and legal and spiritual sense of the word. 2 cups of coffee on a January morning, and outside the world is going about its business. And I am here, in the full and quiet possession of the life I built. And there is nobody coming to take it. That is what 10 years of getting it right looks like. I know this now with certainty. Not because no one tried, but because when they did, I was already someone they had not planned for.